Hello, Cooper 6. Mr. Turner here for the first part of our set of benchmarks on ecosystems and biomes. This is the ecosystems benchmark, and here we're going to talk about cycles of energy, places where energy come from and go to throughout living and non-living systems on Earth. Okay, the first thing we need to know is that almost all of the energy for any and everything on Earth comes from the sun. Yep, a big giant ball of plasma 93 million miles away from us, where the light that leaves the sun takes about 8.5 minutes to get to us. And all of that light energy is what gives us everything we need to basically move energy through systems on Earth. Right? So energy from the sun is harnessed and used on Earth by producers. Okay, producers are living organisms that use processes like photosynthesis. Okay, to take light and turn it into a way to put together chemical compounds. So below is the chemical equation, actual organic chemistry, right? Where a plant or other kind of organism like algae will take carbon dioxide. That's what we exhale. Plants also exhale carbon dioxide, so don't think that plants rely solely on humans and other animals for it. But this is carbon dioxide. This is the gas that we exhale. Okay. They take some water. Think about what you need to keep a plant alive. Water and some sunshine. And through a process called photosynthesis, which can get rather complicated if you look at each little individual step going on. But for us in Cooper 6 science, we're going to just take a look at the magic that happens when you take carbon dioxide and water, add some sun, and it'll rearrange those carbon atoms. That's what the C stands for here for carbon dioxide, and the C in C6H12O6 is carbon. The hydrogen is the H, and oxygen is the O. And these three chemicals, when they're chemically bonded together, right, form glucose, right, which is a form of sugar. Right? And one of the byproducts of photosynthesis, aside from glucose, is oxygen. And that's completely accurate. Right? Plants release oxygen, which is where the bulk and majority of all the oxygen that we need in order to breathe comes from plants. Okay? Understand that the opposite of photosynthesis, if you were to do photosynthesis in reverse, is what we do. Plants also do it, but we call that respiration. To respire, respiration. Right? You take oxygen and energy from sugars. You break it down inside of your body. We don't need the sun for that, but we break it down inside of our body and we get water, H2O, and carbon dioxide gas, right? And we break those bonds here in glucose and other sugars to do any sort of metabolic things in our body, from breathing to pumping our heart to moving our muscles to growing and repairing ourselves, right? And the result after we break these chemicals down here from glucose and other foods is that we get water and carbon dioxide, both of which you can get if you exhale with your hand over your mouth. Right? You feel the heat, you feel the moisture, and that's carbon dioxide gas coming out. Long story short, photosynthesis is what we need to get back on track with. And organisms that do not do photosynthesis rely on other organisms that do. So producers, okay, do photosynthesis. Organisms that don't do photosynthesis need to get their energy from producers. And the category of organisms that need producers to live are called consumers. Okay. And we have some special kinds of consumers here. We have our first kind of consumer, herbivores. These are our first kinds of consumers. They are organisms that only eat producers. Okay, so herbivores like cows, caterpillar, and deer only eat plants. Plants or algae, which are producers. They get their energy from the sun. Okay, our second kind of consumer is called a carnivore, and carnivores only eat other consumers. Okay, lions and tigers and spiders, right? I would say bears, but bears don't quite fall into carnivores, and we'll get to that in just a sec. Okay, these are animals or organisms that only eat other consumers. Okay, they are also a kind of a subcategory of carnivores called scavengers. All right, and these are organisms that do only eat other consumers, but they don't actually go out and kill those consumers. They feed off of the kills of other carnivores who do that for them. All right, so think of different animals that live in like the sub-Saharan African regions that'll feed off of the kills of lions, right, and other large beasts, large carnivores. Then we have omnivores. Okay, omnivores eat both producers and consumers. Okay, and we can be considered omnivores. Bears can be considered omnivores, and crows. All right, the big black birds that'll actually store nuts and other food, and also eat other living organisms that are non-producers. And then we have a strange category of organisms that would be considered consumers called decomposers. Okay, and decomposers break down decaying, all right, organic, and organic is just a big fancy word that means was once living or came from something living. Break down decaying organic matter. So we have decomposers like fungi and bacteria and earthworms and snails. Right, they take that things that were once living and break them down and essentially recycle those nutrients back into our ecosystem so that they can be used again. Right, the waste product of many earthworms and snails and bacteria replenish the soil with nutrients needed for our producers to begin growing again. Right, so those are producers and consumers. Okay, our next topic is looking at relationships between the different kinds of producers and consumers, right? And finding the connections or flow of energy in between them. So, right in front of you on the screen and in your notes, you should see something called a food chain, right? And a food chain is how we look at the flow of energy from one organism to another, right? So, if we talk about, I'll draw a picture of the sun up here, sun. Right, the sun sends its energy to some corn or maize, right? Same word, maybe a different variety of corn, but maize is a very corn-like plant. So the sun shines down and the maize does its photosynthesis and grows and gets its nutrients. Remember, it uses up carbon dioxide and some sunlight and some water, and it makes glucose and some oxygen as it grows. All right, but then one of our first kinds of consumers come along, right? An herbivore, all right? Herbivore, such as a locust, right? Which is a species of grasshopper. And then it eats the producer, all right? So then we come further down the chain and we get another kind of consumer, right? This is a carnivore. A lizard is a carnivore, all right? It'll eat the locusts, right? And again, the flow of energy is from the corn to the locust, to the lizard, and finally to the snake, which is another carnivore, right? And so when we label the kinds of consumers that exist, we kind of go on a path away from the producer. And so you'll see these other words underneath here: primary, secondary, and tertiary. These are words that basically mean the first organism coming from a producer that eats the energy coming from a producer, the second one, right, in a line, and then the third one. So we mark them with a 3 and a degree sign. So that means tertiary for 3 and a degree sign, secondary 2 with a little degree sign above it, and 1 with a little degree sign above it is a primary consumer. You'll see those again and again and again in examples of food chains. Okay, and looking more or less not just at the chain of energy or the flow of energy, but sort of how that energy stacks up in a system where organisms are eating one another, or the flow of energy is going between them, we look at something a bit more complicated called a food web. All right, and so you'll look at this example here, and you'll see that the rabbit eats the grass, right? So one thing you make sure we understand, and I believe this is written right here, is that the arrows represent the flow of energy going from one organism to another. It's not as though the grass is eating the rabbit. It's quite the other way around, right? The energy is going from the grass to the rabbit. Okay? So we've got the energy going from the rabbit to the fox, and there is a food chain right here. Okay? A basic food chain. Okay? You have a more complicated food chain where the grass, right, is eaten by the insect, and the vole, which is kind of a rodent, is eaten by eats the locust or the grasshopper, and then the hawk eats the little rodent, the vole. There's another food chain. But the food web gives you an idea that, right, more than one organism can eat another. So if we look over here, right, the frog could eat the insect, right, or the thrush, a kind of bird, could eat the insect. So it gives you this idea that things are a little bit more complicated than the example up above, where there's just one line of energy flow from one organism to the other to the other. All right, so food webs. Okay, and our final representation of energy flow through systems from one organism to another is the energy pyramid. Okay, the energy pyramid. So in this case, we're looking from the bottom up. All right, we're looking at the sun's energy, all right, helping the producers. And you'll notice that the producers form the base of this energy pyramid. That's because out of all the things that we have the most of producers, right? They're simple in how they get their energy. They can grow plentifully and can have lots and lots of land and places where they can grow. So grasses and trees and other vegetation account for all the primary producers. Also, don't forget about algae, right? These green pigmented photosynthetic plant-like organisms, right, that grow in water too. You see in those green floating things on the surface of lakes and ponds, and even in the oceans, you get these algae blooms. Right, so not just leaves and grass and trees, but also algae. Right, so there are more producers that compared to any other organism on the planet. Okay, and then we start heading up the energy pyramid, and we start moving our way and losing energy as we go up, because the organisms get more complicated, right? So a locust is way more complicated than a piece of grass, right? That the locust is movement, it has a metabolism, it digests foods, right? It has some sense of thinking, right? It has the ability to react to stimulus. So it takes a whole lot more energy for an organism like that to exist than a producer. Then we move our way up again, and we end up with a secondary consumer, like a small bird, right, or a lizard that might eat that insect. And there are even fewer of those by comparison, right? 1% of all of the energy that came from the producer, right? The vegetation, the grass, the trees, right? The vegetables or fruit that were eaten along the way. Only 1% of all of that energy ends up coming back through the energy pyramid to these secondary consumers. A lot of energy gets lost up here, as it says, as heat, right? And these are starting to get more and more complex, these organisms are. and you move your way up, right, to third level or tertiary consumers, like we mentioned, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, and only 0.1%, 1/10 of all the energy that we started with when we had the vegetation, the primary producers that existed, right? Only 1/10 is left of all of that energy. And then you finally get to the way top of the energy pyramid, right, where we have these apex predators. Right? These are organisms that don't have any competition whatsoever. Right? They take what they want when they want, but they only get 1/100% of all the energy that we started with. And if you think about these kinds of things, think about how you see these animals in numbers, right? You start with the producers, those plants, right? You see lots and lots of those everywhere around you. You move your way up to something like a grasshopper or some other kind of insect, and you see lots of those, but not nearly as much as you do plants. All right, and then you look and you see a lizard. All right, you're not going to see very many lizards compared to how many insects you see. Right, and then you think of something like a snake that would eat that lizard. Even fewer, right? Because these things cannot reproduce with as much frequency as these other organisms because they have higher food and energy demands, right? And they're more complicated organisms. And finally, up at the top here, where you have your apex predators, right? You definitely see the fewest of these organisms compared to all of the other organisms that came before it on the energy pyramid. Just because there's so many things that are required to be an apex predator, it requires so much energy. All right, and there's so little of it left by the time you get to the top of the energy pyramid. Okay? I would be not the greatest benchmark giver if I didn't show you that, all right, decomposers are what help us bring all of these nutrients back to the bottom of the energy pyramid again. So as these primary, secondary, tertiary, and apex predators die through natural causes or unnatural causes, right, their bodies decompose, and bacteria and earthworms and snails and other organisms and fungi that do that break down that organic matter and bring it back into the soil for producers to start the process all over again, and again with the help of the sun. Okay, now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the cycles of matter that exist in different ecosystems. Right, the first one, and the one that we'll probably end up spending the most time on, is the water cycle. Right, we have a small group mini lesson further down on the activity list if you want a little bit more detail about the water cycle. Right, but let's talk about water. Right, water, H2O. Right, is two hydrogen atoms bonded to one oxygen atom. Right, and together, when you get a bunch of it together, you get a sense of water molecules in a system. Let's start off by talking about some water hanging out in the ocean. All right, the sunlight will heat up that water. All right, we get some sun heating up that water, and that water will evaporate. So we're going to put that in this little box here, evaporation. That is when the water molecules go from a liquid to a gas state. And because they're a lot lighter and less dense in that gas state, they float upwards and they form clouds. But they only form clouds when they begin to cool off. And we have a special name for when those water molecules begin to cool off in a gas state. And we call that condensation. Okay, condensation, those water molecules turn from a gas to a liquid again, but that liquid kind of stays suspended in the air. All right, and you get clouds. All right, but over time, as these clouds move, they cool off even more, like over the tops of mountains and other places that have a big temperature difference. These clouds will begin to release that water, and that water will fall as a liquid again in droplets, and we call that precipitation. So we have falling water. Gravity pulls it down as a force. We have what is called runoff, when that precipitation hits a surface and begins to run down the sides of hills and mountains and cliffs or some sort of sloping surface. And then it'll flow into some kind of river, stream, lake system. We call that a watershed, and we'll get to that eventually. But we have other ways in which water can kind of move through the system too. These trees are here. And trees, when they absorb water, also sort of release that water through a process sort of like we do when we exhale. Trees exhale that water, so to speak, and they call that transpiration. Okay? And so that's, for the most part, the water cycle. We're going to move on now to another chemical or molecule that moves through, and that one is the carbon cycle. So this is not a molecule like water was. This is just actually one element, one atom in particular, called carbon. All right, so let's take a look at how carbon sort of moves its way through our ecosystems. Okay. Start with some fossil fuels. All right, fossil fuels down here, stuff like coal and oil and natural gas, come from old decaying organic matter that has sat underground for a very long period of time. Think dinosaurs that disappeared a long time ago. They sort of fell where they died and got covered up, and as they decomposed over millions and millions and millions of years, they turned into a fuel, and that fuel is a carbon-based fuel. All right, so they decay. If we take those fossil fuels and we put them into a power plant and we burn them, right, we can get energy from the burning of them, but then that carbon goes back up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. All right, and that causes a lot of issues with our environment and changes our climate. All right, the more we have that compounding, the more we have global climate change. We'll talk about things like global warming in a later benchmark, but that kind of situation happens. But other sources of carbon, right, that occur come from photosynthesis. Right, photosynthesis is a plant or tree's way of taking carbon that exists from carbon dioxide, right, and it absorbs that carbon dioxide along with some sun and some water, and then right creates some glucose and energy, and that energy right can get transferred from a producer like a tree or a plant of some kind, and it could transfer that energy to a consumer like a cow, right? And that cow will of course use that energy, but it will release that carbon through its waste, rather as it respires or exhales and releases carbon dioxide, or it has its own organic waste as it comes out the other end. I'm not going to draw that, but I'll let you think about what I mean by that. So we can also recycle carbon through our ecosystems, right, through consumers. So producers and consumers can release and utilize carbon dioxide, just as we can release carbon dioxide, right, from burning of fossil fuels. And then carbon dioxide can actually be exchanged between the atmosphere and the oceans or water sources. So the carbon cycle, much like the water cycle, right, has a way of moving its way from one spot to another and then repeats again and again and again. Okay, and our last substance that we're going to talk about as it moves through a cycle in our ecosystems is nitrogen. Okay, nitrogen is a chemical that's kind of found everywhere, almost more so than oxygen, because nitrogen makes up most of the air that we breathe. Sounds strange, right? But really only about 20% of the air that we breathe has oxygen in it. The rest of it is mostly nitrogen and some other gases. So oxygen is not quite what you think it is. Pure oxygen would not be overly healthy for us to breathe for long periods of time. So the air that we breathe is a mixture of nitrogen, mostly with other gases, including oxygen. But that nitrogen ends up in the atmosphere as waste, but then it gets cycled back in through a concept called nitrogen fixation. All right, so nitrogen will exist in the waste product of animals and trees and from the atmosphere in our air, but it will get picked up by plants and fixed, okay, to those plants. Nitrogen fixation, right, like the word to be focused or fixated on something, has the bacteria in the soil put nitrogen onto parts of plants called nodules. So we actually owe a lot of the air that we breathe and other chemicals involved in making proteins to bacteria. Right, the bacteria that are in our dirt, in the soil, right, fix that nitrogen onto the plants. And examples of plant nodules include peanuts and beans and peas. So when you eat those things, you're eating vegetables, but you're also eating highly nitrogenated food because bacteria fix the nitrogen atoms onto those parts of plants. And of course, we have producers, right? Those plants being eaten by consumers. Right, so the nitrogen flows from the grass to the deer, and then the deer uses the nitrogen that it gets from breaking down the plants, right, to make protein, right? And the protein is used to help that deer in the picture here gain muscle, right, and be able to function and move. And then, of course, there are other consumers that would come along and eat the deer, taking the protein from the muscle of the deer. All right, and as these organisms are eaten and or die, right, their waste or their decomposition falls back into the soil, broken down by decomposers, right, where the process starts all over again. So the nitrogen cycle, it's not as confusing as you make it out to be. It really just comes from bacteria helping us put nitrogen on plants, which get eaten by animals, right, that end up helping create protein, and then that protein cycles its way up through food chains, right, being eaten by consumers and consumers and consumers until those consumers decompose and the process starts all over again. Okay, we're going to wrap up this first benchmark about ecosystems by talking about not the movement of chemicals or atoms or molecules in an ecosystem, but the actual physical movement of organisms and how some organisms that may not seem like they have a way to move about in an ecosystem actually have very innovative and creative ways of doing so. So let's talk about this idea here called a dispersion, to disperse, right? To spread out from, right? And one of the main ways that organisms can disperse is by using the wind, right? Very light organisms, mostly plants, and very small spiders and fungus spores use the wind to disperse. And I put this picture here of a maple seed just to point out how absolutely incredible a maple seed is. You see them all the time in the fall. They're the ones that when they come down from the trees, they look like helicopter blades. That is an adaptation from the maple tree that realized, not consciously realized, but over millions of years found that the maple trees that had this design on their seeds were the most successful at having more maple trees grow. So through the process of natural selection, right, these maple seeds took on this shape. Again, this took millions of years. It's not like it happened overnight. And again, from many, many, many generations of how this sort of seed changed to be the best it could be, we now have all basic surviving maple trees using this seed shape. And it's very creative and very aerodynamic in how it spins and falls and hits the right place to be spread out the right way. Think about maple trees. They can't just get up and walk using their roots, right? So they had to come up with a very creative way to get their seeds to disperse. I put here for spiders, ballooning. Okay, if you've ever seen Charlotte's Web, the movie that shows how spiders can release a little bit of silk and they can use the wind to grab that silk, and if the spiders are light enough, it will actually pull the spider up into the air, and they can kind of stay aloft using only the wind blowing on the silk that's coming off of them. Pretty creative, right? And then fungi use spores to release, and that's how they reproduce. Those are spread through air dispersion. All right. Then we have water. The best example I can give you, right, are coconuts. All right, that's how coconuts can get from one space to another. They fall from the tree, all right, and then they float in the water to another area of land where they can sort of take root and grow into another tree. All right, and obviously most leaves float on top of surfaces of water and can be transported that way. So you'll get other living organisms, finally, being a way to disperse or transport organisms. And I don't want to ruin this for you, but the whole idea of the existence of fruits comes from the idea of plants manipulating consumers, right? Producers can't just get up and move from one spot to another. So they have to find a really creative way to do so. And fruits, aside from helping the tree or the plant grow, also entice organisms to come over and eat the fruit, and they eat the seed as well. Most of us don't think about that, but animals, right, typically eat the seeds of the fruits. Those fruits make their way through that animal or consumer's digestive system and come out the other end, and then sort of help that producer out, because that seed from the fruit that we didn't digest, the animal that releases that into the wild, has now surrounded that seed with manure to help it start growing. All right, it's very creative on the part of the plant. You also have seeds from burdock plants, which are the sort of spiny, sticky seeds that exist that get on fur. All right, so they'll stick to the fur of the deer, and then the deer will walk and eventually rub up against something, and that seed will fall off. So, yet another incredibly creative way for producers and other organisms that can't move on their own or move very far on their own to get help. All right. And of course, with the ability to move and disperse, we do have limits too. Right? So we have literal physical barriers. Right? Mountains make it difficult for organisms to get around, or deserts to cross. Right? Or you have an entire continent like Australia that is located in the middle of the ocean, making it difficult for organisms to get to or leave, which is why you have such a unique set of organisms living in Australia, because over the time that they've lived there, they've evolved to adapt to living in their environment. You have a lot of unique species there. You also have limits to movement of organisms due to competition between organisms, some having a more successful adaptation to live where they do. And of course, we have limits based on climate, right, which is why you don't see a lot of snakes hanging out in the tundra. Right? It's just too cold, and they are cold-blooded animals, so they're not fit to live in those environments. This concludes our benchmark on ecosystems. Thanks for listening.